Under the shadow of the Colosseum, where the sand still bore the warmth of blood spilled for spectacle, there lingered a belief so chilling it blurred the line between medicine and madness, for Romans whispered that the blood of a gladiator could heal epilepsy. A convulsion of the body answered with a convulsion of ritual, and in the silence after the crowd's roar, trembling figures pressed close, physicians urging them to drink from still warm veins, to swallow the life that had only moments ago defied death. And as the copper taste-coated tongues, it was not only desperation that filled the air but also superstition, a mixture of science twisted with faith. And here, at the heart of empire, medicine was theater, healing was horror, and the boundaries between body and spirit dissolved into spectacle. For in this culture where death was staged as entertainment, it seemed natural to believe that vitality could be stolen, that strength could be swallowed, that seizures could be silenced by blood. And yet beneath the marble arches, behind the chanting of priests, there was a silence more terrible than the screams, the silence of the enslaved, the slain, the sacrificed, whose essence became remedy, whose deaths became prescription, whose suffering was reframed as salvation. And in these moments the glory of Rome revealed its shadow, a place where power justified cruelty, where physicians dressed as healers of flesh were in truth ministers of fear. And so the legend of gladiator blood grew, told in hushed tones in smoky rooms, in bathhouses where men debated cures, in markets where mothers with trembling children sought vials of crimson hope. And though no cure came, only more fear, the practice endured. For desperation is stronger than reason, and in Rome reason itself bowed before ritual. The sick made to drink death, the living made to consume the final breath of the fallen, until history itself blurred fact with horror, leaving us to ask not whether it worked, but what it meant about a people who saw medicine in blood and salvation in cruelty, a civilization that raised arches to the gods but drank from the veins of the condemned. And even now, centuries later, we shudder at the thought, for this was not only a treatment but a mirror, reflecting a society where spectacle was life, and life itself was consumed in endless cycles of death and belief, leaving us to wonder, when the sands dried and the torches burned low, whether Rome ever feared the ghosts of those whose blood they had swallowed, or whether silence was the truest cure they sought. In the narrow chambers where oil lamps flickered against cracked plaster walls, Roman physicians cloaked in white tunics spoke with voices that mingled authority and fear, for these so-called healers of shadows balanced on the edge of science and superstition, writing prescriptions not on clean tablets of knowledge but on bone, ash, and blood, their remedies an eerie mixture of natural observation and ritual sacrifice. And as desperate citizens shuffled into their presence, they were told to swallow ground wolf's liver, to press the ashes of burnt mice against their skin, to drink concoctions made of ushed oysters and wine laced with fragments of iron or bronze, each formula not born from reason, but from a worldview that believed sickness was the punishment of gods and healing required bargaining with unseen forces. And so medicine became performance, half prayer, half experiment, where physicians carved words into lead-cursed tablets, burying them under doorsteps to ward off illness, where healers whispered incantations over wounds, as though the cut itself could hear and obey. And yet these figures, revered and feared, moved like shadows through society, consulted in the courts of emperors, called upon by mothers clutching feverish children, demanded payment in coin or flesh, and promised hope while delivering rituals steeped in dread. For to them the human body was not a temple of biology but a battlefield of spirits, demons, and curses. Every symptom a sign that the invisible world had reached into the living, and every cure a desperate attempt to rebalance the cosmos through sacrifice, whether of animals, objects, or even fragments of human remains. And though Rome admired Greece for its philosophy, borrowing the names of Hippocrates and Galen, its practice of healing was still drenched in blood and fire, a paradox of empire that built aqueducts to bring clean water, but relied on rituals of entrails to chase away fevers. And as these healers traced circles in dust, muttered words into smoke, and pressed amulets onto trembling wrists, they embodied the tension at the heart of Rome, the brilliance of order against the terror of superstition, the promise of progress chained to the fear of gods unseen. leaving behind not only broken bodies but also a legacy of medicine woven with shadows. A reminder that even in the most powerful empire, the line between knowledge and nightmare was thin, fragile, and often crossed in silence. In the glittering dining halls of Rome, where silver lamps flickered against polished marble and goblets of gold clinked in endless toasts, there lingered a fear more potent than hunger, for every sip of wine could be a gamble with death, and the poisoned cup was the silent assassin that haunted senators, generals, and emperors alike, twisting pleasure into paranoia and turning banquets into arenas of survival, where before each meal, slaves, known as pregustatores, tasted the food first, their trembling lips and uncertain gulps serving as shields for their masters. And yet, even this ritual of sacrifice could not guarantee safety, for the art of poisoning was refined in Rome into a science of deception. Powders of hemlock hidden in honey, aconite dissolved in wine, or crushed gems slipped into dishes of figs, each chosen not only for its lethality but for its silence, leaving no trace until the victim convulsed under candlelight, and whispers spread that women of noble families, denied the sword of power, turned instead to venom, mastering the craft of deadly mixtures in secret kitchens where herbs and shadows were stirred together, and the names of poisoners like Locusta became infamous, her skill so feared and revered that even emperors kept her close, ordering deaths with a whisper, rewarding her with estates and gold while Rome trembled at her touch. And thus the poisoned cup became not only a weapon, but a symbol, an embodiment of how trust itself decayed under the weight of ambition, how a feast meant to display wealth became a theater of dread, where guests eyed each other's plates, where laughter was strained, and where loyalty was measured by who dared to drink first. And as this fear spread through the empire, banquets lost their innocence, turning into stages where survival meant suspicion, where love itself could be questioned, for even a wife's hand might pass a chalice laced with death, and so the poisoned cup etched itself into Rome's collective nightmare, a reminder that beneath marble arches and golden ceilings lay a civilization both brilliant and brittle, held together by ritual but undone by mistrust, where every banquet was shadowed by whispers, and every sip of wine carried the possibility of silence eternal, leaving us to wonder how many toasts in history ended not with cheers but with gasps, how many legacies of emperors, generals, and senators were sealed not in battle but in the quiet swallow of poison. In the opulent villas of Rome, where frescoed walls glowed under the light of bronze lamps and couches were draped in silks imported from the East, feasts were not always shared with the living alone. For the Romans held a custom both eerie and intimate, a practice that blurred the boundary between flesh and shadow, where mummified ancestors or wax death masks were brought forth during banquets, placed at the center of the table as honored guests, their hollow eyes reflecting the flicker of fire while the living raised cups in their memory. And in this ritual dining with the dead, families proclaimed lineage, power, and continuity, believing that to break bread with one's forebears was to keep them alive, to weave the present into the fabric of the past. Yet beneath this display lay something darker, for the stillness of the dead became part of the spectacle. Their silence, a chilling reminder that life was fleeting, their presence a subtle coercion that demanded respect, obedience, and the continuation of tradition. And as goblets brimmed with wine and platters of roasted boar steamed with spice, the air was thick, not only with luxury but with the weight of mortality, every bite taken under the gaze of ancestors whose flesh had long returned to dust, and yet whose masks stared as though watching, judging, perhaps even whispering through the silence of the hall. And in these banquets the Romans revealed a civilization obsessed with memory, with the eternal, with ensuring that power did not end with death but continued through ritual performance. For even emperors joined in this eerie communion, parading the busts of divine predecessors, draping them in garlands, setting them before senators as though the dead themselves had cast a vote. And so the feast became not only about sustenance or spectacle but about domination, where lineage was weaponized, where the presence of the departed was used to enforce loyalty, to remind the living that rebellion would not only betray the emperor but desecrate the sacred ancestors of Rome itself. And as the candles burned low and shadows lengthened across the marble floors, one could imagine the unease that crept into the hearts of the diners. For though they raised toasts in reverence, though they smiled under painted ceilings, deep inside they must have felt the cold breath of death at the table, the reminder that one day their own faces too would stare silently from masks, their bodies paraded as relics, their presence turned into ritual, and the feast would continue without them. For Rome consumed not only food but memory, not only flesh but legacy, binding the living and the dead in endless banquets of shadow. Beneath the gilded ceilings of palaces, beyond the marble columns where incense curled in the air, Rome's emperors revealed themselves not as guardians of order but as architects of cruelty, men whose power was so absolute it dissolved into madness, and in the shadows of their reigns history drips with stories that read more like nightmares than governance. For Caligula, draped in silks and crowned with arrogance, humiliated senators by forcing them to run beside his chariot or grovel at his feet, declaring himself divine while whispering threats of execution with the flick of a hand, while Nero, lover of theater and flames, turned Rome itself into his stage, strumming the lyre as fire consumed neighborhoods and later orchestrating the agonizing deaths of those he accused, including his own mother, for whom he plotted poison, drowning, and finally, a sword across her belly. And in these acts the emperors became both performers and predators, masters of ceremonies and spectacles of pain that went beyond the arena, weaving cruelty into politics, weaving terror into daily life, and the empire obeyed, not out of love but out of dread. For who could resist a ruler who could make execution a banquet game, or who could turn the humiliation of the powerful into sport before the eyes of the crowd? And yet in this theater of shadows, their cruelty was not random but ritualized, a performance that reminded Rome that life and death lay in their hands, that the emperor's whim was law, and the law was often madness itself, and so the empire thrived under fear, an order held together not by justice but by spectacle, not by reason but by the chilling knowledge that no one was beyond the emperor's reach. And as the torches dimmed and the whispers grew, it is said even the senators who applauded felt their hands tremble. Even the nobles, who smiled at feasts, felt the cold breath of terror at their necks. For to live under such rulers was to walk forever on a stage where one wrong glance, one ill-timed word, could end in silence eternal. And thus Rome's emperors etched their legacies not only in conquest and stone, but in shadows, where cruelty was law and madness was crowned, leaving us to ask, how does an empire survive when its guardians are its monsters? And how do shadows grow so deep when lit by the fires of power? In the glittering halls of Rome, where marble floors echoed with the shuffle of sandals and golden chandeliers dripped with firelight, banquets became spectacles that blurred the line between celebration and nightmare. For these feasts were not mere gatherings of food and laughter, but orchestrations of excess that revealed the empire's darkest appetites, where emperors and nobles sought to display their wealth through grotesque abundance, serving dishes that bordered on the absurd and the obscene, with dormice fattened on honey, peacock brains presented in jeweled bowls, and flamingo tongues arranged like delicate petals upon silver platters, each course not designed to nourish but to shock, to remind every guest that Rome's power could consume anything, even the rarest creatures of the earth. And yet beneath the perfumes of cinnamon and pepper, scents imported from lands conquered by legionnaires, there lay the sour undertone of fear. For to refuse a dish was to insult the host, and to insult an emperor was to court death. So guests forced themselves to chew pearls dissolved in vinegar, a luxury so wasteful it was cruelty disguised as sophistication, their stomachs straining under the weight of endless courses, their eyes darting nervously as entertainers paraded through the halls, gladiators staging mock duels among the tables, slaves pouring wine until it spilled crimson across the marble like blood. And though laughter rose, it was laughter sharpened by terror. For some banquets were designed not for pleasure but for humiliation, with emperors watching as nobles gorged themselves to sickness, mocking those who could not endure, turning the act of eating into a weapon of dominance. And as the night deepened, as candles dripped and shadows stretched long against frescoed walls, one could sense the unease growing beneath the surface. For these were not feasts of joy but feasts of horror, where food became theater, where appetite was twisted into cruelty, and where Rome revealed itself as a civilization intoxicated with both luxury and fear, its banquet stages upon which human dignity was devoured course by course, leaving behind only the bitter taste of power and the uneasy silence of those who knew that in Rome, even at the dinner table, death was never far away. Beneath the bustling streets of Rome, where vendors shouted in markets and senators argued in marble halls, another world thrived in whispers and shadows, for the Romans believed that words etched into lead and buried in secret places carried power darker than swords or laws, and so cursed tablets, thin sheets of metal inscribed with pleas to underworld gods, were folded, pierced with nails, and cast into wells, graves, or temples, binding rivals, lovers, thieves, and enemies in spells of suffering, each line written with trembling desperation, calling upon spirits to blind, to cripple, to silence, to destroy. And while public life in Rome seemed ordered and disciplined, behind closed doors citizens turned to these hexes as weapons, trusting in the unseen where justice failed. And so black magic and superstition wove themselves into daily life, where an angry shopkeeper might curse a competitor's business, a jealous lover might bind the heart of the unfaithful, or a gladiator, fearful before combat, might beg the gods to hobble his opponent's legs. And the language carved into these tablets dripped with menace, invoking demons of the grave, deities of the underworld, and spirits of the restless dead, demanding their intervention in human affairs. And often the names of victims were written backwards, twisted into symbols to amplify their suffering, as if language itself could wound. And while these practices may sound like fragments of myth, countless tablets have been unearthed, their letters still sharp, their malice still echoing after 2,000 years. Each one a testimony that beneath the grandeur of Rome, there pulsed a civilization, haunted by fear, envy, and desperation, where curses were not whispered tales but active rituals, performed in dim chambers by candlelight, guided by professional sorcerers who profited from despair. And so the empire's greatness stood side by side with shadows, aqueducts bringing clean water above, while wells below hid nailed tablets dripping with hatred. And in this tension between reason and superstition, Rome revealed its soul, a people who worshipped the gods of Olympus, yet begged the spirits of the underworld for favors, who built temples to Jupiter yet buried curses under his very altar. And as the city grew, so too did its shadows, until the very stones seemed heavy with whispered malice, leaving us to wonder how many lives were ruined, not by the sword, but by the belief that unseen forces, invoked through ritual and hex, had the power to bend fate itself. Beneath the blinding sun, in an arena where the roar of 50,000 voices rose like a storm, Rome revealed its truest obsession. For entertainment was not laughter or music but blood, and the Colosseum stood as the empire's cathedral of cruelty, its sand soaked with the lifeblood of slaves, prisoners, and gladiators who fought not for glory but for survival, each clash of steel against steel echoing across marble arches as nobles and commoners alike leaned forward in hungry anticipation, their eyes fixed on the spectacle, their hearts pounding not with compassion but with thrill. And here life became theater, death became ritual, every scream wove and into a script written by emperors who knew that the crowd's loyalty was purchased not with bread alone but with spectacle. And so beasts imported from Africa and Asia, lions, leopards, elephants, were unleashed upon trembling men, their roars mixing with the gasps of the audience, while gladiators, trained in barracks that felt more like prisons, were sent into the arena with armor gleaming and bodies scarred, their fate determined not only by combat but by the thumbs of the crowd, a simple gesture that could seal life or summon death. And though poets wrote of Roman virtue, and marble statues depicted idealized heroes, in the Colosseum the truth was bare. Humanity stripped to blood and sand, cruelty woven into entertainment. And yet the people cheered. Mothers lifting children to watch, senators reclining in shaded seats, emperors appearing with crowns of laurel to bask in adoration, for here the empire reminded its people that Rome's power was not only political or military, but visceral, a dominance written in blood before their very eyes. And beneath the noise, beneath the frenzy, one cannot help but imagine the silence of the condemned men, who prayed in whispers as they entered the arena, who kissed amulets, who glanced skyward in one final plea, and yet were consumed by a crowd that demanded their suffering as though it were sport. And when the sun set, when the torches burned, and when the bodies were dragged away, the arena was swept clean, as if nothing had happened, as if lives had not ended, as if Rome itself had not fed upon its own humanity, leaving behind only silence until the next morning, when the crowd would gather again, eager for another performance of death, another feast of cruelty, another reminder that in the empire's heart, entertainment and blood were one and the same. If the darker side of Rome unsettles you yet fascinates you, stay with us as we uncover more hidden truths about ancient empires, gladiator rituals, and the shocking secrets of history. Subscribe now and step deeper into the shadows of the past, where every story reveals another forgotten horror. In the bustling heart of Rome, where marble temples glistened under the Mediterranean sun, and senators paraded in togas woven with purple threads of power, the empire's glory was built not on its own strength, but on the backs of countless slaves whose voices were silenced, their names forgotten, their bodies consumed by endless labor. For while Rome celebrated its victories with arches and feasts, it was the silent slaves who quarried the stone, who hauled the marble, who poured the wine and cleaned the blood from the sand of the Colosseum, and their presence was everywhere, yet acknowledged nowhere. Shadows moving through villas, fields, and streets, their existence reduced to tools of flesh, and though some were captured soldiers from distant lands, Gauls, Thracians, Carthaginians, others were children born into servitude, never knowing freedom, never knowing the dignity of choice, and in this silence lay the empire's deepest cruelty. For these men and women were not only workers, but playthings, forced to amuse their masters, punished at a whim, used in rituals of humiliation that echoed Rome's obsession with power. And the stories that survive speak of cruelty beyond measure, of slaves thrown to beasts for minor disobedience, and of servants crucified along roads as warnings, their bodies left to rot beneath the sun, their agony transformed into spectacle. And yet despite this horror, their silence was not always emptiness. For in the quiet glances shared in kitchens, in the whispered songs sung in fields, in the subtle defiance of slowed labor or hidden sabotage, there flickered a resistance, small but enduring, a reminder that even in chains humanity does not vanish, and though the empire sought to erase them, to make them invisible, their presence shaped Rome in ways greater than emperors dared admit. For it was slaves who raised aqueducts, slaves who tilled the soil, slaves who filled the arenas as gladiators, slaves who served in the intimate chambers of emperors. And when the empire grew decadent, when cruelty outweighed order, it was slaves who revolted, most famously under Spartacus, whose rebellion shook Rome's foundations and forced its rulers to confront the truth they sought, to ignore that beneath the silence was anger, beneath the obedience was humanity, and beneath the empire's glory was blood not celebrated but stolen, leaving us to wonder how many stories never reached us, how many names vanished without inscription, how many lives were extinguished without trace, and how a civilization that prided itself on law and order was held aloft by the silence of millions whose voices, though erased, still echo in the ruins. In the heart of imperial Rome, where marble palaces gleamed and the fragrance of roses drifted across manicured lawns, there existed gardens unlike any others. For when Nero wished to illuminate his nights, he did not rely on torches of wax or oil, but on human bodies set ablaze, transforming his private pleasure grounds into spectacles of horror, where Christians, bound to posts, were coated in pitch and ignited, their screams piercing the night air as flames clawed upward to cast a ghastly glow across fountains and statues, and as the emperor reclined in silken robes, strumming his lyre, sipping wine from golden cups, and laughing with courtiers, the very air was thick with the mingling of burning flesh and sweet perfumes, a juxtaposition so grotesque that it seared itself into memory. For this was not simply execution but performance, a calculated act of terror meant to remind all who watched that Rome's ruler held dominion not only over life and death, but over the spectacle of suffering itself. And guests invited to these festivals found themselves complicit, forced to applaud or feign delight as human torches lit their path, their silence purchased by fear, their laughter sharpened by unease. For to show disgust was to risk joining the pyres. And so Nero's gardens became both theater and warning, a place where cruelty was elevated to art, where power was measured by how far one could bend humanity into horror. And though centuries have passed, the echoes of those nights remain, for archaeologists uncover charred stakes and ancient texts describe the terror, leaving us to imagine the faces of those who endured the flames, their final prayers swallowed by the crackle of fire, their bodies transformed into grotesque lanterns beneath the Roman sky. And this spectacle, though framed as justice against a minority faith, revealed instead the empire's addiction to fear, its willingness to turn death into entertainment, its hunger for control that could corrupt even the sanctity of gardens, which in Rome were symbols of beauty and peace, twisted here into arenas of torment. And as the fires burned low and ashes scattered into the soil, Nero's laughter lingered, his gardens haunted not by flowers but by shadows. And the memory of this cruelty, preserved in whispers and chronicles, stands as one of the darkest chapters of Rome, a reminder that beneath the marble, beneath the music, beneath the luxury, there smoldered an empire willing to burn its own people alive for spectacle, power, and control. In the reign of Domitian, where paranoia draped the imperial palace like a veil, feasts that should have been celebrations of abundance transformed instead into chilling theaters of fear. For the emperor was notorious for staging banquets that blurred hospitality with menace, summoning senators and nobles into vast dining halls, where the atmosphere was heavy with dread, the marble walls painted black, the ceilings draped in dark cloth to mimic the stillness of tombs, and the tables themselves set not with garlands or laughter but with silence, each guest seated before a bare black slab illuminated only by flickering lamps shaped like funeral urns, their faint glow casting ghastly shadows across faces pale with unease, while around them loomed executioners dressed in crimson, their axes gleaming in the firelight as they stood wordless beside the diners, a silent promise of death at a single nod from their master. And as Domitian entered, robed in black himself, crowned with ivy yet grim as a spectre, his eyes scanned the trembling assembly, and he ordered the feast to begin, though no music was played, no conversation allowed, only the scraping of knives on plates and the shallow breaths of men and women who dared not speak. And the food itself, though fine in quality, became tasteless under such tension, each bite chewed in silence, each swallow heavy with fear. And this performance of terror revealed Domitian's true intent. For the banquet was not about sustenance or even luxury, but about domination, about breaking the spirit of Rome's elite, forcing them to sit in the prose essence of death, to feel the cold breath of mortality at their necks. And when the feast ended, when guests staggered out alive, they carried with them not gratitude but terror, bound forever to the emperor by the memory of that night. For he had shown them that life was his to grant or to end, and that even the simple act of dining could become a ritual of dread. And though history records his cruelty in whispers and accusations, these banquets remain some of the most haunting, for they captured Rome's obsession with power, its transformation of pleasure into punishment, its capacity to turn the human need for food into a weapon of fear. And, as the empire feasted, beneath the marble grandeur lay the echo of those twisted nights, when laughter was forbidden, when death stood behind every chair, and when an emperor ruled not only with the sword, but with the shadows he conjured at the table. In the labyrinth of Roman faith, where temples rose to countless gods and incense curled through marble arches, there thrived secret sects that whispered promises of eternal life, but demanded offerings darker than prayers. For among these shadowed mysteries was the cult of blood, an underground religion that found power in sacrifice, in ritual baths of crimson, in the belief that the life essence itself could cleanse, renew, and grant immortality. And those who sought its embrace gathered not in sunlit forums, but in hidden chambers beneath the city, where flickering torches revealed altars stained by generations of offerings, and priests, robed in black or crimson, spoke incantations that mingled fear with ecstasy, calling followers to kneel as animals, and at times humans were slaughtered, their blood caught in basins, their lifeblood poured over initiates who trembled as it ran across their skin, a baptism not of water but of flesh. meant to bind them to gods who ruled not from Olympus but from the underworld. And while Rome tolerated many cults, these rituals unsettled even the hardened, for the cult of blood did not promise civic order or prosperity, but transcendence through violence, salvation through suffering, and its echoes can be traced in accounts of the worship of Cybele, whose followers castrated themselves in frenzied devotion, or Mithras, whose mysteries included the sacrifice of bulls and the bathing of initiates in their warm blood. The Taurobolium, believed to wash away sin and confer divine favor, and these rites, though shrouded in secrecy, reveal an empire grappling with mortality, with the terror of death, and with the longing to overcome it through extremes. And so senators, soldiers, and slaves alike found themselves drawn into shadowed chambers, drinking from chalices, chanting in tongues, binding themselves to rituals that horrified outsiders but promised transformation to the faithful. And though the marble temples above preached order and law, beneath the city pulsed a different Rome, one enthralled by blood as both curse and cure, one that reflected the empire's deeper truth, that cruelty was not only entertainment, but also faith, that blood was not only spilled in arenas, but also sanctified in secret altars. And as the empire expanded, these cults spread with it, their rituals whispered along the frontiers, their promises carried by legionnaires and merchants, until Rome itself seemed less a city of reason than a crucible of shadows, where faith and horror intertwined, where belief required blood, and where salvation itself was purchased through sacrifice, leaving us to wonder how many souls knelt in darkness, how many bodies fed these rituals, and how deeply the cult of blood carved itself into the heart of Rome. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of Rome's Grand Thermae, where marble pools shimmered with heated waters and steam curled into the air like incense, there lingered whispers that the baths were not merely places of leisure and cleansing, but spaces haunted by the weight of blood, curses, and secret deaths. For while senators reclined in heated chambers and commoners splashed in crowded pools, behind the laughter and the hum of voices lay stories of shadows moving along the mist, of sudden shivers that seized even the healthiest men, of voices echoing through the caldarium long after midnight when no attendants were present. And the fear was not without cause, for the baths were more than social halls, they were also scenes of violence, of plots enacted beneath the cover of steam, where rivals were drowned in silence, their gasps hidden under the noise of splashing water, or stabbed in corners where fog concealed the glint of blades. And though attendants swept the pools clean each evening, the marble was said to hold memory, to retain the whispers of agony and the stains of murder. And in certain districts cursed tablets have been unearthed, dropped into the drains of the baths, their inscriptions pleading for the gods of the underworld to strike down enemies who bathed there, to blind them with fever, to choke them with phlegm, to rot their limbs from within. And these hexes mingled with the water, flowing unseen into every pool, so that the act of cleansing was laced with dread, as though each plunge beneath the surface risked communion not with purity but with malevolent spiri. T.S. and the Romans, obsessed as they were with omens, took note of such tales, for even emperors felt unease, knowing that beneath the marble grandeur the baths doubled as stages for intrigue and as vaults of curses too potent to ignore. And so the very heart of Roman daily life, the public bath, became a paradox, a place of vitality and decay, laughter and fear, purification and haunting. And as steam blurred the outlines of statues and oil lamps flickered against dripping walls, one could almost see the shapes of the lost, those drowned, those cursed, those silenced, still drifting between the rooms, unseen but felt, a reminder that in Rome, even in spaces designed for rest, the shadow of death moved like water itself, filling every chamber, every corner, every whispered breath rising through the mist. Beneath the bustling streets of Rome, beyond the reach of sunlight and the clang of legionary boots, stretched a labyrinth of catacombs and burial chambers known as the tombs below, a silent world carved into stone where the living often descended to commune with the dead. And though meant as places of rest, these underground corridors became stages for eerie rituals, for Romans, obsessed with ancestry and the afterlife, carried food, wine, and offerings into these spaces, dining beside sarcophagi, whispering prayers to ancestors whose bones lay inches away, believing that such feasts bridged the divide between life and death. Yet in the flicker of oil lamps against damp walls, shadows seemed to move, and whispers grew louder than prayers, giving birth to tales of spirits that roamed the tunnels, restless souls disturbed by centuries of intrusion. And some who entered spoke of sudden chills that clung to their skin, of unseen hands brushing their shoulders, of voices echoing names in the dark. And though skeptics dismissed these as imagination, archaeologists later uncovered evidence of gatherings, graffiti etched into stone recording invocations to gods of the underworld, pleas for protection, and curses hurled against rivals, proving that these tombs were not silent but alive with ritual. And in some chambers bones were rearranged, stacked into patterns that resembled altars, suggesting that ceremonies of unknown purpose unfolded in the deepest corridors, where silence was broken only by chanting and the sound of dripping water. And though the empire above glittered with marble and light, below lay this secret Rome, damp, suffocating, yet filled with meaning, where death was not hidden but embraced, where families sought comfort in the presence of ancestors, and where cults exploited fear to bind followers through rituals of shadow. And as the centuries passed, Christians, too, gathered here, blending their prayers with older rites, until the tombs became both sanctuary and prison, a place where faith grew under threat, yet also where memories of pagan ceremonies lingered like ghosts. And when one walks these corridors today, the air heavy with dust and the scent of earth, it is easy to imagine the living feasting with the dead, raising cups in trembling hands, convinced that every sip, every word, was heard not only by their ancestors but by something darker, something waiting in the silence of Rome's eternal underground. In the vast squares of Rome, where temples rose like mountains of marble and incense smoke curled toward the heavens, the emperor was no longer seen as mortal flesh but as a living god, a figure whose breath was law and whose glance could seal fate. For the empire demanded not merely loyalty but worship, and statues of Augustus, Caligula, and later Domitian and others stood draped in garlands, their faces carved in divine serenity, their names invoked in prayers alongside Jupiter and Mars. And across the provinces, shrines to emperors multiplied, where citizens knelt before altars, sacrificing doves, bulls, and sometimes even humans to secure the emperor's favor. And though the Senate once claimed to balance power, in practice Rome bent beneath this cult of divinity, where men drunk on absolute authority cloaked themselves in sacred robes, demanding titles like Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, as Domitian once did. And their subjects, trembling under fear of execution, echoed these words, lest suspicion mark them for death. And festivals of worship turned into performances of loyalty, with crowds chanting the emperor's name, gladiators dedicating their kills to his glory, priests weaving hymns that blurred the line between reverence and terror. And beneath this veneer of piety lurked madness, for to believe oneself a god was to believe one's cruelty sanctified, one's whims divine decrees. And so emperors indulged in humiliations, punishing senators by stripping them naked before statues, forcing nobles to worship them as if they were Olympus reborn. And in such rituals Rome's dignity decayed. For even as legions conquered nations, within its heart the empire bowed to men who demanded divinity while living like monsters. Their temples filled with offerings not of faith but of fear, their divinity purchased not with miracles but with blood. And yet the people complied, mothers teaching children to salute statues, soldiers swearing oaths upon the emperor's name, merchants offering coins stamped with his godlike visage. For to resist was to vanish, to defy was to invite silence in the night. And so the cult of the emperor thrived, reshaping Rome into a theater where politics became religion, where tyranny became worship, and where men who were flawed, paranoid, and mortal cloaked themselves in immortality, leaving behind a legacy that even today chills us, for it asks what happens when humanity bows not to gods but to rulers who crown themselves divine, and how much cruelty can be justified when power calls itself sacred. In the chaotic whirl of Saturnalia, Rome's most famous festival, the boundaries of order dissolved into chaos, and beneath the laughter and songs lingered a cruelty that revealed the empire's darker heart. For during these days of reversal, masters dressed as slaves, and slaves as masters, dice games filled the streets, drunken revelry spilled into temples, and yet behind the masks of joy lurked menace. As punishments and humiliations were disguised as jest, with nobles paraded in rags, servants ordered to mock their lords, and violence simmering beneath the pretense of liberty, for Saturnalia was not merely a holiday but a ritual inversion of power. A reminder that freedom itself was only ever temporary, granted as spectacle before chains were tightened again, and in these festivals, cruelty masqueraded as celebration, with citizens forced to laugh at their own degradation, gladiators pitted against one another as part of the fun, and animals sacrificed in such numbers that the stench of blood hung over the streets, mingling with incense and spilled wine. And for the emperors, these days provided opportunity to display dominance disguised as generosity, tossing coins into crowds, offering lavish feasts, then reminding all that such gifts flowed only from their hand, that joy was permitted by their mercy, and even in the games played in homes, mock kings were appointed only to be ridiculed, stripped of dignity by the end of the night, their laughter forced, their faces pale beneath wreaths of ivy, and the poor, who relished the fleeting freedom, awoke to find nothing changed, their lives still bound to toil, their chains only heavier after days of false release, and thus Saturnalia embodied the paradox of Rome, a festival of cruelty wrapped in laughter, a moment when the empire revealed its power by pretending to surrender it, only to reclaim it with sharper force. And across the provinces, similar festivals echoed this pattern, where celebration blurred into bloodshed, where sacrifice blurred into entertainment, and where the cruelty of empire was not hidden but celebrated, sanctified by tradition, leaving behind a legacy that forces us to question whether joy can ever be pure when built on humiliation, whether laughter can ever be genuine when it echoes against the cries of the enslaved, and whether Rome's greatness was ever more than a mask worn over cruelty, a mask that cracked wide open every festival season. In the hushed chambers of Apollo's temples, where incense smoke curled upward in trembling ribbons, and the air trembled with expectation, Rome sought its future in the cryptic voices of oracles, women who spoke not in reason but in riddles, their words carried like whispers from the gods themselves. And leaders, generals, senators, emperors, traveled great distances to kneel before these shadowed figures, desperate for guidance, yet the answers they received were wrapped in ambiguity, sentences that slithered like serpents, phrases that could be twisted to mean victory or disaster, and thus the oracles held power not in clarity but in mystery, their whispers shaping wars, marriages, and laws. For who would dare to defy a prophecy believed to come from the divine? And in this way Rome's destiny was often entangled with shadows, battles launched on the strength of a riddle, treaties broken because of a whispered phrase, executions carried out because an oracle's murmur suggested betrayal. And though some suspected manipulation, for priests and politicians often shaped the oracle's words to suit their needs, the people believed, the people trembled, the people bent beneath the weight of prophecy, and in that belief the oracles ruled, unseen yet everywhere, their whispers echoing through marble halls, their cryptic sentences repeated in markets and taverns, their voices haunting the minds of rulers who lay awake at night, wondering if the gods had condemned them. And so the empire was haunted, not only by swords and plagues, but by the invisible hand of prophecy, guiding decisions through riddles that no man could fully understand. And this reliance revealed Rome's deep unease, for though it prided itself on law and order, its leaders still sought direction in whispers and smoke, still trembled before women possessed by divine frenzy, still allowed shadows to shape destiny. And in this contradiction Rome unveiled its soul, a civilization that built roads and aqueducts, yet trusted whispers carried from unseen worlds, a people who conquered continents yet feared the uncertain promise of words spoken in trance. And as the empire stretched further, the demand for prophecy only deepened, for with power came paranoia, with wealth came fear, and with fear came desperation to know what lay ahead, leaving us with the unsettling truth that Rome's greatest leaders, men who commanded legions and ruled nations, were often guided not by reason, but by whispers, fragile, trembling, and eternal. Death in Rome was never hidden, never softened, but elevated into spectacle, obsession, and ritual, woven into every corner of the empire's life. For the Romans believed that mortality was not only inevitable, but something to be embraced, feared, displayed, and controlled. And so funerals became grand processions, where masks of the dead were carried through crowded streets, their ancestors paraded as though alive again, reminding every onlooker that death was part of lineage, a performance of continuity. And, in the arenas, death was the very currency of entertainment. Each gladiatorial clash, turning mortality into theater. Each final breath absorbed by cheering crowds who treated blood not as tragedy but as necessity. While in private homes, Romans kept wax masks of their dead, stored in shrines and brought forth during family feasts, so that meals became eerie communions between the living and the departed. And in philosophy, Stoics wrote of death as liberation, poets sang of its inevitability, while mystery cults promised salvation only through rituals soaked in sacrifice. For to the Roman mind, death was everywhere on the battlefield, in the banquet, in the temple, in the marketplace. And this constant presence bred both awe and obsession, a need to control it through ritual, to honor it through spectacle, to laugh at it in festivals like Saturnalia, where mock executions became entertainment. And even the architecture of the city whispered of death, from the towering tombs along the Appian Way to the catacombs beneath, where the dead lay in endless rows, their silence filling the dark corridors. And the people walked among these graves not with avoidance but with reverence, leaving offerings of food, coins, and wine, as though the dead still dined with them. And yet, beneath this acceptance was a deeper unease, a fear that death might not end but linger, that spirits might return if not properly appeased. And so charms were worn, curses inscribed, and sacrifices made to keep the dead at rest, revealing a civilization both enthralled by and terrified of the inevitable. And this obsession shaped everything from the laws that governed inheritance to the rituals of war, where fallen soldiers were buried with coins for Charon, ferrymen of the underworld, ensuring safe passage across the river of death. And in these acts, Rome displayed not only its fascination, but its dependence on death. For the empire itself thrived on conquest, on the death of others, on the fear of mortality turned into control. And as we look back across the centuries, the ruins of Rome still echo with that obsession. Every arch and stone a reminder that in this empire of marble and blood, death was not the end, but the stage upon which life itself was performed. Behind the shimmering marble facades and towering arches that declared Rome's invincibility, the empire began to rot from within. Its grandeur a mask stretched thin over a body racked with hunger, plague, and fear. For as feasts of flamingo tongues dazzled the elite, the poor starved in crumbling tenements, their cries drowned by the laughter of nobles reclining on ivory couches. And while senators debated in gilded chambers, the streets outside filled with refuse, disease spreading like wildfire through the slums, turning Rome's very heart into a breeding ground of death and famine. Driven by corruption and over-reliance on grain shipments from distant provinces, made bread scarce, riots frequent, and loyalty brittle, so that the empire's promise of plenty revealed itself as illusion, a facade cracking with every hungry face, every riot in the forum. And though monuments still rose, their stones gleaming under the Mediterranean sun, they stood like masks, hiding an empire hollowed by inequality, corruption, and despair. And the legions that once brought glory now carried back plague, unseen enemies stronger than swords sweeping through baths, temples, and villas, reminding Rome that conquest had a cost, that the world it devoured also devoured it in turn. And beneath the pageantry of triumphal processions lay paranoia, emperors retreating into palaces fortified like prisons, surrounded by spies and executioners, their power sustained not by love but by fear, their cruelty a brittle shield against the crumbling order. And in this tension the people whispered of omens, of gods abandoning Rome, of shadows lengthening as the empire's heart faltered, and the silence of slaves grew heavier, the curses in wells multiplied, the feasts turned bitter, until the empire itself seemed a haunted stage, its monuments echoing with a grandeur no longer real, its people trapped in a play of decline, pretending strength while death hunger, and madness gnawed at its edges. And though history remembers Rome for its glory, the truth is etched in these shadows. For behind the facade of power lay fragility. Behind the triumphal arches lay ruin. Behind the empire's mask lay a face already crumbling, already broken. Though the empire's walls have long crumbled, though the marble has cracked and the legions vanished, the shadow of Rome endures, an eternal specter stretching across centuries. For the horrors that once burned in the Colosseum, the blood rituals whispered in secret chambers, the twisted feasts of emperors, and the haunted silence of the catacombs still echo in our world today, reminding us that greatness and cruelty often walk hand in hand, and when we gaze upon ruins kissed by sunlight, we do not merely see fallen stone, but the memory of suffering, the cries of slaves, the laughter of emperors as bodies burned in gardens, the whispers of curses buried under thresholds, the fear of poisoned cups raised at banquets. And in these fragments we confront the unsettling truth that Rome never fully died, for its practices, its obsessions, its fascination with death and spectacle linger in the bones of modernity, reflected in our hunger for violence as entertainment, in our rituals that mask cruelty as tradition, in our leaders who flirt with power as divinity. And so the eternal shadow of Rome is not confined to ruins but lives in us, a mirror held against humanity, showing what empires become when glory is built on blood, when power is sanctified through fear, when death is turned into spectacle. And as we walk through ancient forums, as we trace our fingers along worn inscriptions, as we read the accounts of madness and cruelty preserved by historians, we are reminded that the past is never silent, that Rome's shadow still breathes, not only in history books but in our choices, our societies, our hunger for power and control. And though the empire fell, though centuries swept over its ashes, the eternal shadow of Rome remains, haunting us with its lesson, whispering that beneath every monument of greatness lies a darkness waiting to rise again, if we dare forget. You began with whispers of gladiator blood, a cure born of fear and ritual. You walked through Rome's haunted feasts, its twisted emperors, its hidden cults, and its cruel obsessions. The empire has long crumbled, yet the shadows remain. Rome's darkness still breathes through ruins, through stories, through the nightmares that refuse to die. History is not only glory carved in stone, it is also horror etched in silence. And as you leave this journey tonight, remember, the past is never gone. It lingers, waiting for those willing to look into the shadows.